Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm making a tier list for tanks in the upcoming patch 10.2 raid, Amir'drassil. This will just be focused on the raid. I will make a separate tier list for Mythic Plus. If you want a more focused deep dive on a specific tank, or all 6 of them, you should check out the State of the Class videos we've made over the past couple of weeks. We made one for each of the 6 tanks, talking about how we've gotten here and what the future holds for them in the upcoming patch. Alright, so just to lay some groundwork before actually diving in, I want this video to be in 3 main sections. First is a quick run through of the 9 fights in the raid. Technically, we've only tested 8 of them, but we can intuit a lot from Farak's dungeon journal, and I think we have a decent idea of how every fight will perform from a tanking perspective. Then we'll talk about tank utility in raids, which is slightly separated from their overall performance. A tank can be a really awesome utility powerhouse and still not actually be all that great in the raid. We've seen that with Pally in the past. I don't think that's going to be the case this raid tier, but it has happened at points in the past, and if I miss on anything in predicting in this list, it'll probably be because I wasn't able to differentiate between the value of utility and the actual ranking of overall strength. And then we'll wrap up by actually ranking the tanks relative to each other and how I think they're going to be in terms of both power and popularity in the coming raid tier. So first, let me just lay a foundation by just talking about tier lists. The WoW community's approach to tier lists is so different from every other video game community I think I've ever seen. Tier lists, at least in my mind, are basically just like a framing device for talking about something. It's an excuse to have a conversation, or a monologue. For most other games, the tier list is like a representation of how things are performing relative to each other in-game right now. You go watch an Elden Ring weapons tier list, it's gonna be someone playing the game, killing every boss with each weapon in the list, and then ranking them all relative to each other. Maybe they'll rank on subjective metrics like, I thought it looked cool, or it felt easier to use. Maybe they use more objective metrics like, this weapon did the most DPS, and it had the longest reach. In either case, they're not making predictions, they're evaluating things relative to each other on some scale that they've decided. WoW tier lists are basically all predictions. They're not a review of what's currently good in the game, they are previews of upcoming content. They're guesses. So with all of that being said, here is my educated guess at what I think everyone will agree is the best. I may miss on something, or you may disagree. Both of these are fine. Alright, so here we have the dungeon journal for Amir'drassil, the Dream's Hope. It is a 9-boss raid. Let's double check and make sure I didn't miscount anything. Yeah, Llarold is 5, that makes 9. We tested 8 bosses, we obviously didn't get to test Farak. We can look at his model in the dungeon journal though. Looks, pretty cool, about like you'd expect. So just starting with Llarold and then going through all of these, I took a handful of fairly basic notes on these bosses, and the main things that I wanted to emphasize here are, does the boss have a damage over time effect? Because there are 2 tanks that are proportionately, or I should say disproportionately effective at dealing with damage over time, and those would be Prot Paladin and Blood DK, because Prot Pally just gets a whole bunch of extra damage reduction against damage over time, and Blood DK just doesn't care where the damage comes from at all. So they have this real advantage over the other 4 tanks. And of the 9 tanks, Llarold does not have damage over time, neither does Council of Dreams or Llarold, but Igur the Cruel, Volcaros, they both have damage over time. Naimu, however, has damage over time, although it's environmental damage, so that's not generally a big deal, certainly not a problem, a concern for Blood DK or Prot Paladin, but it does make it disproportionately a lot more dangerous for Demon Hunter. And then Smolderon doesn't have damage over time, but Tendril does, and Farak does during the final phase of the fight. So that's 4 bosses that have damage over time, and 1 that does during the final phase of the hardest fight in the raid, presumably. So about half the raid has damage over time, so that right there is a pretty good indicator that those 2 tanks are probably going to be at the top of any respectable tier list prediction list of how the tanks are going to be performing in the coming raid. It's not quite as bad as it was in Aberrus, where you could just go dot, but it's not that far off either. Now, in terms of taunt swap mechanics, because that really is the main thing that tanks have to manage. You have to manage boss positioning and add pickup and then taunt swaps. I also wanted to check, do fights have adds? Gnarlroot has adds. Council of Dreams is a council fight, so you do want to tank these 3 guys near each other, but they don't have any sort of adds. Agura and Volcaros don't have adds. Llarold has some fairly minor adds, but technically they're present in the fight. And they have this really low-budget ancient appearance to them, so that's fun. Naimu has adds, but they're adds during an intermission phase, so you're not fighting these at the same time that you're fighting the boss. You are actually detaching from the boss to go attack them, like running across the room. Smolderon, no adds. Tendril Swage, whatever his name is, Taylor Swift, does not have adds. He turns into different guys. I like that owl model a lot. That's pretty cool, but no adds. So that's a pretty clear indication, I think, that other than maybe Gnarlroot, there's really not a lot for Blood Decays to grip around. So that's kind of a strike against Blood Decays. It's kind of strike against all of the tanks that do really well against adds. Really want to have a lot of adds to pad on. We're talking Bear Druid, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Brewmaster Monk, in fact. A lot of single target in this raid, and even in situations where you can cleave, there's just not a lot of adds to clean up on. So now I just really want to talk about the actual taunt swap mechanics in each fight. So on Gnarlroot, the taunt swap mechanic is this one right here, Dreadfire Barrage. This is very similar to Magmarax, how Magmarax wouldn't just bite you one time and then you taunt swap. It's actually 3 different bites. Dreadfire Barrage is, I think, 5 or 6 bullets made out of both physical and spell damage, and it goes brap, and it blasts you with all of them, and then you taunt afterward. If you taunt during the cast, then it'll split onto both tanks, and then you have a situation just like taunting too early on Magmarax, where you are refreshing the buff and splitting it back and forth, and that's pretty annoying. In terms of the way he spawns his adds, it's actually a really cool mechanic, because it's probably the best first fight in a raid that I can remember in years, where he shoots out lines of dormant adds. They're basically pods on the ground, and then he will put a mechanic on players, this right here, Flaming Pestilence, where they drop a fire patch on the ground, and so you can drop those fire patches on the ground to spawn the adds. You can also kind of stagger those, so you could have the fire patches on the ground already, position the boss so that he's near the fire patches and will spawn the pods into the adds, and then the adds will just immediately spawn and you can blow them up. And the reason that you want to do this is that when he transitions into his intermission phase, he pops all the adds out at once, and I think they do a bunch of damage when they spawn. So you don't want to have all of them spawn at once and kill your raid. That is probably the most interesting tank mechanic that occurs in the entire raid from all of our testing, though, which is a little disappointing that it happens on the first fight, and then the next fight is like, this boss auto attacks. But that is what she does. She auto attacks, she stacks a bleed on the main tank, and then she saber lashes, or whatever other mechanic that you want to call it. She double hits the main tank if there is no one nearby, but the range on that's pretty far, so it is a very annoying fight to do, and I'm pretty sure I do have footage of this stupid fight, where if any melee get near the tank, they're going to get instantly killed. The 2 tanks basically have to be hand in each other's pockets the whole time. Very annoying fight type of mechanic to do. And then there's really not a lot else going on in this fight. There's some soaking for other people to do. There's some stuff that deals damage to you, a little bit of dodging. But it's sort of like a low rent version of Sludge Fist from Shadowlands, if that's a fight you remember. If not, whatever. It's just, you and the other tank are going to be holding hands, and you taunt swap back and forth to make the bleed fall off, but that's pretty much all there is to it. Volcaros is a big ol' worm boy. The only real special thing he has going on is that he also has a damage over time effect, where each auto attack puts a stacking dot on the tank, and it makes you take more damage from his big tank strike, this thing right here, Cataclysm Jaws. Now, obviously, if you've been auto-attacked 10 times, you're going to be taking 500% more damage from the Cataclysm Jaws. So if he were to hit you with a Cataclysm Jaws, it hits for 2.4 million and 415,000 fire damage, while also taking 500% more from that. You can't live through that. I don't even think you can Divine Shield through that. I think it would hit too hard and break it. Maybe not. Either way, what you do is, as the cast has started, the other tank who doesn't have any of the Molten Venom debuff taunts, and then it just goes on to the second tank, who takes just this much amount of this basic amount of damage, and you obviously use a cooldown for it. And then you tank until you get high stacks of Molten Venom, and he starts casting Cataclysm Jaws, and then the other tank taunts off, and so you swap back and forth like that. Kind of underwhelming, and there is a lot of damage over time in this fight, but, you know, it works pretty well. And I think if I remember correctly from testing, I was able to, on a Prot Warrior, have Shield Wall up for every single time I had to taunt for Cataclysm Jaws, which was not bad. Council of Dreams is a council fight. You have to kill all of them at the same time. You have these two guys, Erwin and Pip, who kind of move around on their own and do their own thing, and the two tanks are just taunting Urktos back and forth. He has a frontal tank cone that he does Agonizing Claws. It does massively increased damage if it hits you 2 times in a row. Kind of like Magmarax's tank combo or Gnarl Root's tank combo. You want to taunt after it is concluded because it does multiple hits over time, and if you taunt while it's in the middle of the cast, it'll debuff both tanks, which sucks. He does one combo, and then about 2 or 3, maybe 5 seconds later, he'll do another combo. And then he waits like 20 or 30 seconds before he does any more. So you do need to 2-tank this fight, probably. For progression, I think everybody's going to be 2-tanking this fight, but it's not a situation where it's like evenly divided like a tank combo every 10 seconds for the whole fight. It's more like 2 in the span of 5 seconds and then a 20-second break. He also has another mechanic where he charges at the tank, and this has to be split among players because it does raid-wide damage, and that's reduced by how many people are hit by it. But also it has a mechanic where it leaves a debuff on you so you can't soak 2 charges in a row. Additionally, all of the bosses have different little mechanics that will wipe the raid if you don't interrupt them by using a different boss mechanic. So like Pip will do a song, and the way that you cancel it is, I don't remember, I think you stand in poison for this one. He will cast Polymorph Bomb on people, turning them into ducks, and Urktos will do this channel where he will start wiping the raid, and the way that you knock him out of it is by dispelling Polymorph Bombs onto him and turning him into a giant duck. The way that you cancel Erwin's Constricting Thicket that will stun the raid or slow him or, you know, basically wipe the raid is you run the charge through her, and Urktos will start chain casting charge whenever she's casting her Constricting Thicket. So you need to hit her basically with the first one. Yeah, I mean, it's really as simple as pointing a line at the boss, but it's also as hard as pointing a line at the other boss. Llarold probably has the most unique tank mechanic that I've seen in a while. He does a charge on the tank. It deals raid-wide damage based on how far he's traveled. More damage the less he travels. So as soon as he starts casting the charge, you need to get out of melee range very quickly, and it will hit you and then knock you back, and also make you take massively increased physical damage. I think it's 100% increased physical damage per stack, but it starts at 10 stacks, so it's important in this case to do a taunt swap during the charge, because he won't change targets until after he has finished the charge and then started running back in. But obviously, if there isn't a taunt there, had this happen a few times, and was responsible for this a few times as well in testing. I'm not blaming anybody, but I guess I am. I'm also blaming myself, though. If the taunt is slow, he will hit the end of the charge and then immediately auto attack. There's also some weird bugginess with this where like I hit spacebar on a Demon Hunter to glide back in from it, or I hit charge on a warrior to charge back into melee range as soon as I was knocked back. And so in some of those cases where you're like you're canceling the knockback, it will just hit you like 5 times in a row and kill you that way too. So you kind of want to let it do the whole thing. Hopefully that gets fixed, but at least until that has been sorted out, which will probably take them, you know, it's Blizzard, it'll probably take them a few weeks of that bug existing before they sort it out. So not great, but like a weird incentive on tanks to, as soon as the boss starts casting his ability, to move out of melee range really quickly, which isn't totally unique. I mean, there's plenty of mechanics in the history of the game that force tanks to get out of melee range, but usually the boss will do a thing and then you have to leave and then come back in, rather than he starts a cast and you have to leave before the cast ends. That's kind of the only real interesting thing in this fight, to be honest. There's some other stuff, but nothing really all that interesting. I mean, later on in the fight, he does like a frontal cone called Smoldering Backdraft, And this is a mechanic where you do need to wait until the end of the cast to taunt, because if you taunt beforehand, he will spin and cast the Smoldering Suffocation on somebody else, which is a frontal cone that makes you immune to healing, and, you know, yeah, not great to blast the raid with that. Pretty much a guaranteed wipe. I did it during testing to see if it would wipe the raid, and it did. All right, now we have Naimu. Naimu was a pretty good fight, I think, until Blizzard decided to make the tank debuff a hidden aura, because it also goes on other players. That's called Weaver's Burden. And the way that this works is you have about 6 seconds or so to get out of melee range and get deep off into the corners of the room, because as soon as this explodes, you get a buff that makes it so that you can walk safely through the room. But it also doubles your nature damage taken and causes you to leave behind a flower that knocks everybody back when they try to move into that area. It basically creates a forced area denial until the end of the next intermission. At the end of each intermission, the boss will suck up all the old blossoms and the room is re-cleaned. Now, the reason that you have this buff that allows you to pass freely through the room is because you're not free to pass through the room throughout most of the fight. As I do have some footage here that'll hopefully show this off. There are all these lines on the ground that have this like green glow through them. And if you walk through the green glow, you get a massive damage over time effect on you, and it is nature damage, and the tank debuff makes you take double nature damage. So there's just a very, very dangerous negative synergy there. This is a situation where Prot Pally actually isn't that great, because there is a combination of movement and damage over time, which, you know, is kind of... damage over time is the paladin specialty, but you have to not be moving. So there's going to be a lot of like recasting consecration and maybe standing still for a second on Pally on this fight, which just sounds wretched. But it's an option. But because this mechanic right here, Weaver's Burden, has been made a hidden mechanic, it's not possible to track when it goes on the other tank. So this like completely messes with the way that I do weak auras for fights, and it's just very annoying. I even wrote in my notes here, like, why? How could God let this happen? I absolutely hate this aspect of the fight, and I get that it is to prevent weak auras from solving something for the DPS, but like, it's just deeply annoying to have weak auras broken for knowing exactly when to taunt and when it's safe to move back into melee range. Like the instant that aura would fall off, it's just very, very annoying. Other than that, the fight's really not all that interesting. She does ranged, physical, and nature damage tank hits. That's pretty much it. There are some ads in the intermission, but they are not like small grippable ads. They're like big guys. They look like this. Big old dudes. You tank them on opposite sides of the room. It's kind of it. Smolderon is basically a two-phase fight. He does like a big tank slam that is a split damage mechanic, and it can only be soaked once per phase per person, because you get this debuff called Ember Scar's Mark that makes you take 500% damage from that hit if you take a second hit of it. But the intermission mechanic, the first spell in intermission, is Devour Essence, which removes this effect, and it actually allows you to get a huge damage increase. So the goal is for 10 people to soak one tank strike, and then 10 people to soak the other tank strike. And you repeat that throughout the fight. In terms of what this does, it just does a ton of damage to the tank, so you do need to have a major cooldown up for it. The other tank should taunt during the cast, because it'll still go on the original tank. And then as soon as you are hit by the mechanic, you have this debuff called Searing Aftermath on you. You have 6 seconds to get as far away from the raid as you can. I think it's about 40 yards. Because you do 2 million damage to all players. Players farther from the target receive less damage. So, you know, pretty classic. Get hit by a boss mechanic, move out of range, explode, come back in. I like this fight a lot. It's in Ragnaros' old room, and he sort of looks like Balrog, and it's sort of a combination of some old mechanics that I think a lot of people will find familiar. If you remember Cataclysm Ragnaros, there are some of those mechanics. Some flame waves and some seed type behavior. World in Flames is one of the mechanics in the intermission. So that's pretty familiar for the old school type of players. And finally, we have Tendril Sage Swift. Again, Taylor Swift here is a sort of balanced druid type of guy. He's got a flight form and an evil flaming tree form that looks... Man, I am surprised that they went with this ancient old low poly count model for this, but I kind of like it. I bet it was going to look real stupid when he's very large, but that's fine. So his main tank mechanic, the one that actually causes your taunt swaps, is just a boring damage over time effect. He auto attacks you, it puts a damage over time on you. That's it. Very, very boring. The interesting tank mechanic is Wild Mushrooms. Now, the way that this works on all the difficulties below Mythic is he summons a mushroom every 3 seconds for 9 seconds. So that's 4 total mushrooms. He'll summon one, then 3 seconds later another one, and so on and so on and so on. Until he's summoned 4. And you get a 3-second debuff each time you soak a mushroom, and they do a combination of physical and magic damage. So for tanks, you have to alternate which tank is soaking the mushroom, right? So tank 1 would soak mushroom 1, tank 2 soaks mushroom 2, tank 1 soaks mushroom 3, tank 2 soaks mushroom 4. Pretty easy, and it's important that you soak them all or else they'll do raid wiping damage. But other than that, they don't really do that much damage, and this physical damage effect, it's dodgeable as a monk. I think it maybe is parryable for the classes that have high parry chance. I didn't check and I haven't looked. It was blockable as a warrior, and then the fire damage component is spell blockable. I mean, that's how it should work, but it is nice that it does work that way. So that's pretty good, and this actually isn't all that dangerous as a tank. I would say that the Searing Wrath, the damage over time effect, is actually a lot more dangerous. What happens on Mythic is he adds a second mushroom into each set. So he's not summoning 1 mushroom every 4 seconds. He's summoning 2 mushrooms, or 1 every 3 seconds for 4 total mushrooms. He's summoning 2 every 3 seconds for 8 total mushrooms. Had to stop and do math there for a second. Wow. So the way it works is, you know, if I'm tank 1 and you're tank 2, I take the fire mushroom first and you take the poison mushroom first, and then we swap. So me fire, you poison, then you fire me poison, then me fire you poison, then you fire me poison. And I do have footage of that, and it's really quite difficult to actually get to all of these if you're not playing a class that has pretty high mobility like a monk, or I think Druid is actually really nice here. I think Paladin's probably in pretty good shape here, being able to use the Divine Steed for this mechanic specifically, I think will be pretty good, but otherwise it's going to be kind of tough. Like Blood DK, I think is in a bit of trouble. I think Warrior's actually in a bit of trouble because it's such a short distance that you don't really want to heroic leap it. But if you don't use heroic leap and you can't charge, you're actually pretty limited on mobility options as a warrior. I was using speed enchants for this fight, and I found them to be immensely helpful. Like, I think I wouldn't have been able to do this particular mechanic without speed enchants, which was, you know, is a pretty fun mechanic, I have to say. The only thing about this fight that I don't really care for is that the intermissions are flight sections where you fly to a new platform, and then the fight changes a little bit as you progress to new platforms. A lot of the same mechanics will carry over, like the mushrooms, like the damage over time, all the tank stuff will carry over, but then there's more stuff for like raid members to deal with, which, you know, that sucks for them, whatever. And then finally we have Farak, who we don't really know that much about, but what we do know about him is that his main tank mechanic is a slash that deals damage, you know, both physical and magic damage, the classic. And it puts a debuff on you for 40 seconds, and the debuff makes it so that you take spell damage every time he lands an auto attack. And that's sort of a talent swap. No idea if it's immutable, no idea if it's AMSable. Obviously, if it is, that's a humongous advantage for those two classes that would be able to immune or AMS it. There's no chance in hell that this is spell reflectable. Don't even think about it. But you know, if it's not, then I don't know. I don't really think it's that big of a balance changer. I think it just kind of becomes a steady amount of damage pressure on the tank. So that's kind of good for Blood DK, but that's about the only tank where I would say like they gain any sort of advantage by this not being immutable in any way. And obviously if it's immutable, then that's a huge advantage for Paladin. And yeah, that's kind of it. Those two are the only classes that can win in this situation, and in the worst case, they're still in pretty great shape. His only other real mechanic here is Predator, where he leaps at his current target if they're not within melee range, which means he's probably going to be kind of difficult to drag around. Now, this particular line reminded me of a specific fight, and that would be Sire Denathrius, because it's very similar language. Whenever Denathrius is unable to reach his target, he shifts through the shadows to their location and strikes him for 50% weapon damage. So my thinking here is that this is probably going to work the same as Denathrius, where it's not the instant that you move out of melee range, because it's very similar language here. I don't think he's going to move at you, like leap at you the instant that you move out of melee range. I think it's probably, if he hits the end of his swing timer and you're 20 yards away, he will teleport to you. So this is sort of intended to make moving the boss around technically easier. We'll see how it works out. It seems pretty cool either way. You'll note that this is a full melee attack's worth of damage, unlike Denathrius, who did 50%. So maybe this doesn't replace his auto attack, or maybe this does replace his auto attack and it's not like an extra hit. But maybe it's an extra hit. Maybe you get 2 melee attacks worth of damage if he decides to predator leap toward you. I guess we'll find out. And then the only other really notable thing that was definitely for tanks is his phase 3 mechanic, which is Infernal Maw, which does an absolutely insane amount of physical damage and applies a stacking dot that has no expiration. So this is, of course, a huge advantage for Blood DK. And Prop Paladin, because if it's AMSable or immunable, then that's a huge advantage right there. But even if it's not, they're also the 2 classes that are best dealing with an infinitely stacking damage over time effect. So, the rich get richer. All right, now let's move on to utility. All right, we have our little tier list maker here. And I'm just going to go left to right, starting with Blood DK, just kind of go the classic alphabetical route. Death Knight starting off. So the main forms of utility you have as a Death Knight are Anti-Magic Shell, can be useful for immuning some tank mechanics. There aren't really a ton of those that I can think of that'll be particularly great in this raid. The only ones that really stand out would be things from Farak, which would be pretty incredible if it's possible, but we just don't know at this point. So I really don't want to evaluate purely based on wild speculation like that. What I can say is we know that Blood DK has Death Grip, and yeah, you can bring a DPS DK. You could also bring, some other classes that have knockarounds and stuff, knockbacks, Ring of Peace, whatever, but nothing really compares to a Blood DK's ability to Death Grip and to Gorfine's Grasp. And the problem is, there's really not that many fights in this raid that have a lot of opportunities to grip ads around. You have Gnarl Root, great fight, first fight, a lot of ads to grip around. Cool. Now I'm looking at my list again. There's Llarold that has a few ads, but they all walk toward the melee range, so you don't really need to grip those around. Naimu has ads, but they're intermission ads. They're big old boys. You do not grip them around. And then Farak has some ads. Maybe you grip them around, but we don't even know. They might not be grippable at all. They seem like they're also big ads, like big infernal guys. So that leaves 1 fight with ads you want to grip around, 7 with ads you don't want to grip around, and maybe 1 with ads you want to grip around and maybe not. And that's pretty much it. Blood DKs are able to immune knockbacks, which is also useful. There's not a ton of knockbacks in this raid, and the main one I can think of is on Volcaros, where it's actually kind of useful. You use it to knock yourself in a direction that you want to go and get out of a ground damaging effect. So I don't really think Blood DK's utility is all that great this raid. It's possible that they overperform my expectations there. Maybe those grips on Farak are really great. But 1 fight out of 8 that we know that the grips are going to be useful. Maybe 1 other night fight where it could be useful. Still 2 out of 9, still not great, and that's replaceable utility. And then other than that, no sort of debuff, no sort of group buff. All you have is anti-magic zone, which has been nerfed pretty hard over the years because of how good it was for Blood DK. Not a great opening look for Blood DK in terms of utility in this raid. I still think they'll be good in this raid, but I don't think that their utility is particularly great. So they're straddling the line of B and C. We'll call it B. B for Blood. All right, now Demon Hunter's utility really just comes in 2 forms. 1, they have Darkness, which is a pretty decent defensive cooldown, but it has gotten nerfed. It's a 20% chance. Well, it used to be a 20% chance to avoid all damage. On a baseline 5-minute cooldown, I think you can knock that down to 3 minutes with talents. And that's like an AoE so you know it is an actual proper raid cooldown. That's been knocked from a 20% chance to avoid damage from all hits to 15%. And then in Mythic Plus, in non-raid settings, that amount is doubled, so it becomes 30%. So it's a pretty nice Mythic Plus buff. Pretty nice buff for PvP, I guess. Not that I care about that. But that's a nerf to their already fairly limited utility in raids. Other than that, they have the magic damage debuff, which is excellent. I guess you have Sigil of Silence and Sigil of Chains, but considering there aren't really many ads that you're going to want to silence or chains, they're probably the single worst tank in terms of group utility for raids. C, because the magic damage debuff is the most important one, and, you know, it's great. There are more specs that deal magic damage than there are that deal physical damage, that's for sure. But that's kind of all you bring, and Havoc is pretty great. So I'm going to put them pretty much down at the bottom of the list. Now, Druids historically have been pretty great in terms of utility. I think they're probably trending downward at the moment. For one, Innervate has gone from being a 10-second buff that makes your healer, you know, you can cast onto healers, and you can cast it in bear form, which is nice. And it makes them so that they have no mana cost for, used to be the next 10 seconds, now it's going to be the next 8, so that's also getting nerfed. Other than that, you have a little bit of group healing through After the Wildfire. That's really good in Mythic Plus, one of the better tank utilities. It adds a ton of HPS in Mythic Plus, but in raids, it's proportionally a much smaller amount. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's just so much more raid healing going around. In a raid, there's a lot more healers proportional to the size of the group. And it's just a lot easier for people to optimize toward maximizing their HPS in a raid setting than it is in Mythic Plus. So that steady trickle of healing that you provide is still somewhat useful, but not nearly as useful as it would be in Mythic Plus. All of the sort of AoE crowd control that you have as a Bear Druid that's useful in Mythic Plus, kind of useless in Raid. The only other real things that you have that are particularly great are you have Stampeding Roar, which is pretty good. Everybody likes to have move speed, and all Druids get it, but it's one of those types of utility that's like, it's okay to have redundancy. It's pretty nice to have more than one person who can provide Stampeding Roar. Never hurts to have it from the Bear Druid. And then 2, you get Mark of the Wild. If you are the only Druid in the raid, which is highly unlikely, then that is 3% more versatility for everybody. It's great for damage, great for healing, great for defenses. You know, everybody loves more versatility, but it's pretty rare that you're the only Bear Druid, or the only Druid in a raid, I should say. Definitely pretty rare that you're the only Bear Druid, but usually you're going to find one of the other specs of Druid has managed to slink their way in there, and that just really cuts into Bear Druid's value in terms of utility. So I really think that they're below Blood DK, probably ahead of Demon Hunter, but again, kind of straddling that like middle of the pack line. Brewmaster Monk is kind of in a similar situation as Demon Hunters, where they bring a damage debuff. They bring the physical debuff, though, which I'll talk about this probably more in the Mythic Plus tier list. But the physical damage debuff is probably the worst of the 3, or I guess 4 now. Wow, 5 tanks have some sort of buff that increases the group's damage. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that the physical damage debuff is the worst of the 5. Because like versatility, that's all damage. Attack power, that's, I don't know, maybe that's worse than physical damage, but I don't think so, because there are tons of specs that operate off of attack power that are allegedly auto attackers, allegedly physical damage dealers, like, you know, Ret Paladin or Havoc Demon Hunter, that still deal a lot of magic damage. There are very few classes that deal like purely physical damage. You know, Arms Warrior, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of others that you can think of, Fury Warrior, that sort of thing, but even specs that you would think of as being predominantly physical damage still have some magic in them. Whereas there are very few magic damage classes where you're like, oh, this guy's a caster, and then he does physical damage. Demo Warlock, that's kind of the only one I can think of. And even then, they still do a bunch of shadow. So that is kind of crappy for Monk. However, they have a lot of mobility, which, I mean, I guess a lot of these other classes do too. You know, Demon Hunter has a lot of mobility. They do get some redemption in the ability to leap out of range and then leap back in really quickly. But Monk has the unique ability to speed taunt bosses, which is, I would say analogous to Death Grip, except that it kind of works in the exact opposite of Death Grip, where Death Grip's useful on adds, getting them into melee range quickly. Speed Taunt is useful on bosses, getting them moved around a room quickly. You wouldn't really care about Speed Taunt for getting adds into melee range. You would care about it for the things that aren't grippable, that are too big and too immune to be gripped. There are a lot of bosses where Speed Taunt might actually be useful in this coming tier. Like, there are certainly some. Volcaros, he's rooted in the middle of the room. You're not going to Speed Taunt him. Who cares? But like Gnarlroot, being able to move Gnarlroot around the room a little bit quicker to like get him to fire patches, that could be useful. Being able to move Llarold around the room quickly to, I don't know, get into the right spot to drop some fire somewhere with the Furious Charge, that could be useful. Moving a boss like Smolderon around the room to get out of fire patches that are on the ground, that'd certainly be useful. And the only bosses that I can think of that are like actually fixated, rooted in the middle of the room are Volcaros and Naimu, whereas all the rest of the bosses, there's an advantage to having the Monk Speed Taunt. So I think that's useful. I think that puts them ahead of Demon Hunters. It probably even puts them ahead of Bears, probably right on par with Blood DK, because Blood DK does technically still have Anti-Magic Zone. Brewmaster Monk doesn't have any sort of group defensive value, really. Again, this is all like one big rock fight down here in the garbage tier. And then we talk about Paladin. Paladin, unlike the 4 other tanks that have some sort of group buff, Paladin has auras, and you want 2 Paladins, because you have 2 useful auras. You have Devotion Aura, 3% damage reduction, and you have Retribution Aura, which is up to 5% more damage. On average, it's like 2.5, but like, okay, so you want 2 Paladins all the time. Ret Pally's not that great. You probably don't want to bring a Ret Pally. Maybe you do, but that's rarely the case. So that means you want at least 1 Holy Paladin and probably a Prot Paladin. And then you add in Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Spell Warding, which is uniquely available to Prot Pallies and allows them to cheese a lot of mechanics. And then you also have Divine Shield, and you have Blessing of Sacrifice, and I mean, you know, it's pretty hard to argue with Pallies ever not being the top group utility provider. They're just the best in the game at it. You know, it's like I said in the deep dive on Paladins, it's basically like playing 50% of a dedicated healer's toolkit while also getting every single thing you would want out of a tank as well. And that's true here in terms of group utility and raids. And lastly, I think it's Prot Warrior. Now, Prot Warrior is getting punished a little bit for the, I don't know, the excesses of like high-level raiders. Rallying Cry's getting nerfed from, with talents, it was a 20% health increase for 13 seconds in the run-up to patch 10.2. Once that nerf goes in with patch 10.2, it's going to be 10% for 10 seconds. That's it. But technically, you are getting a talent point back to spend somewhere else. So I don't think it's the end of the world. And, you know, Rallying Cry, still better than not having Rallying Cry. It's definitely still better than Anti-Magic Shell. Still better than Darkness. Still better than the nothing that Bear Druid and Brewmaster bring to the group. You also have Battle Shout, which I think is considerably better than the physical damage debuff. It's not better than the magic debuff. I've seen a lot of warriors complaining about how they're not thrilled about I don't know, I've seen like mixed results from DPS warriors in the run up to this patch talking about how it's going to be great or how it's not going to be great. No idea what's real and what's copium. I haven't bothered to like sift through. I just know that when I see warriors, DPS warriors sort of mixed on how they're going to perform in the next tier, that usually bodes well for Prot Warrior, certainly bodes well for their utility. You know, you eventually reach a critical mass on the amount of Rallying Cries that are useful in a group. You have to have at least 1 warrior for that Battle Shout, but then once you have 1, that's all you need. You don't get bonus points for having multiple people to apply the easily applicable damage buff. But you know, that ability to have Rallying Cry, I think it's better than anything that the other 4 tanks below them on this particular list are bringing to the table. Definitely below what Prot Pally brings with the ability to like fundamentally alter the trajectory of raid in strategies with spell warding, but it's a pretty good defensive cooldown for the raid, and I don't think anybody else is bringing anything on that level. And then also you get a bunch of movement utility, charge, heroic leap, Intervene, technically still a usable option, and a much more usable option now that you're losing that point that you were committing to buffing Rallying Cry. So not the end of the world that that's going away. All right, now let's move on to the actual tier list. Okay, and so the reason that I got all of that utility talk out of the way is I didn't want that to be bogging down what I was thinking about when I was talking about like the quote-unquote actual tier list, where I'm really just talking about how tanky is this tank going to be. And then, you know, damage, I want to like consider damage, but a lot of that stuff is still being simmed out. Nobody really knows for sure. Like right now, this is what the damage tier list sort of looks like. But it's all like a big old guess. But like this is sort of what the damage tier list looks like right now, but it might look more like this, where it's Pally below Warrior and what, you know, Warrior up top. But then it might also be more like this, where Pally's up top and Warrior and Brewmaster are tied, and then Blood DK is a little behind. What we know pretty well for sure is that Demon Hunter and Druid are probably going to be falling behind a bit, but we just don't know with 100% certainty. And there's some real weird degen stuff happening right now in some of the like Simcraft communities with Brewmaster Monk, where maybe the Nizao build might be coming back, in which case then the balance of tanks would look like this. Like we make one above as well, and then like a couple more, and Brewmaster Monk would be like cursed to the horrible existence of doing like just vastly more damage than all the other tanks while playing an absolutely insane degenerate play style. I don't want that to happen. I hate that possibility, but it's certainly, it's possible that Brewmaster Monks are going to have some sort of cursed play style that deals a ton of damage again. I really hope that doesn't wind up being the case. So anyway, let's just talk about how I think the tanks are going to flesh out in terms of the combination of tankiness and dealing with the mechanics in the raid and staying alive, the sort of basic goal of being a tank. And I think that Paladin and Blood DK are basically going to be the top two tanks again. I think that they were probably the two best tanks in most of Aberrus. I know Brewmaster Monk was super popular. I played it. I love it. I prefer it to both of those two in raid, but I think it probably wasn't quite as well suited for most of the mechanics of the raid. And a lot of the reason that it got picked in that top three is, you know, it's consistently pretty good, and there are a lot of people who are pretty good at it and pretty comfortable with it. But also, Windwalker and Mistweaver just weren't that great, as is always the case, and you got to get that monk debuff somewhere, so you get it from the one monk you bring, and the one monk you bring is a Brewmaster. I think that Brewmaster's probably better suited to this upcoming raid than it was for Aberrus, because there's not quite as many fights that are damage over time, and that's great, but, you know, there's still like a lot of damage over time. There's still a lot of mechanics that Brewmaster Monk does pretty well at dealing with. Just, you know, big old tank hits, big strikes. Volcaros in particular, the big Cataclysm Jaws where you have to just suddenly take a like multi-million damage tank hit. No problem, hit Dampen Harm, Celestial Brew, taunt the boss, and live without any issue. Press Purifying Brew once and you're good to go. But I still think I'd prefer Prot Paladin and Blood DK if I were like from afar, not having to play it, choosing what somebody was going to play in raid. I think that these two are the best suited for the vast majority of the fights. For one, there's not that much movement required in this raid. Like Gnarl Root, there's some movement on Gnarl Root, but it's just like walking around with the boss. Agira the Cruel, there's a little bit of movement, but it's like walking around without any movement skills active. Volcaros, same deal. Council of Dreams, that's where you do have a bit of burst movement, but that's where Divine Steed comes in. That's, I guess, where Wraithwalk or Death's Advance could maybe get the job done, but maybe Blood DK loses a bit of their step there. In any case, I think that Paladin, it has so much ability to deal damage from range, and there are a few fights where you get forced out of melee range here and there. We're talking about Smolderon, Naimoi, Agira leaps out of melee range at some times. Council of Dreams will leap out of melee range at some times, so Paladin is kind of sitting pretty in those situations, still able to generate resources and deal damage. And then there's just a lot of damage over time in here again, so again, that's a huge advantage for Paladin and Blood DK. Similarly, you know, Blood DK is always going to be in the upper echelon of tanks because they're able to Death Strike and keep themselves alive a pretty much regardless of what type of damage they're taking, and that's certainly going to be true here. Even if there's nothing that you're able to AMS, even if there's nothing you're able to immune, which I know for certain you are able to immune the tank debuff on Llarold, the one that makes you take 1,000% more physical damage. You're able to bop that off. You're able to Divine Shield and immune that. So that's pretty good. Even if there are no spells that you can anti-magic shell, which there probably will be a few, you're still in pretty good shape defensively by playing a Blood Decay. It's pretty hard to go against that. You could argue maybe the balance is something more like this. I think that Brewmaster Monk is probably just a slight step behind them. Minus. Okay, there we go. Prot Warrior has gotten a really, really huge advantage from their tier set. Like, the underlying class hasn't been changed. Like, with the exception of Vengeance Demon Hunter, none of the tanks have really been changed coming into this patch. There have been some nerfs to raid utility, but that's more like the base class. You know, we're talking the Rallying Cry nerf, that sort of thing has been changed. That affects the whole class. Like, in terms of actually affecting the tank specs, there's been almost nothing in the way of changes for specific tank spec nerfs and buffs and shifts in balance. It's basically all been the tier sets. And that is sort of another reason that I wanted to put Brewmaster Monk a step down. Like, right now, if we look at all the tank tier sets and their damage increases in raid, Paladin set is something like 15% more damage in raid. DK set is something like 18% more damage in raid. Prot Warrior set might be like 25% more damage in raid. It's insane. The Demon Hunter set is about, I think, 18% more damage in raid or so. And the Druid set, if you can consume the entire shield, is maybe like 16% more damage in raid. The Brewmaster set is 5.5% more damage in raid. Right now, it sucks. It's seriously undertuned. I like the mechanics of it. I think the mechanics work really well, and I think it scales pretty well into Mythic Plus and into AoE situations, even though it's still a little undertuned there. But the single target tuning on the Brewmaster tier set for the upcoming raid tier is criminally low. It's an abomination. So that, I think, is enough to kind of make me knock it down below the two, like, S tier, top tier tanks. And it's really the only reason that I would even consider putting Warrior up into that kind of Brewmaster tier, because I think that their tier set is really great. You have this very high uptime on 14 to 16% damage reduction. You have this very huge source of single target damage increase in a raid that is, I mean, it's not as single target damage heavy as Amir'drassil was, considering that was a pure single target raid, but it's not that far off. There's still not that many ad fights. It's pretty single target heavy. So I think that Prot Warrior is probably going to make a slight resurgence, but it's probably still going to be suffering from the fact that the underlying class just isn't that amazing either. I would like to see Prot Warrior make a big resurgence. I would love for them to be a top tier tank in the coming tier, but if I'm doing like full on prediction mode, I think that something similar to the breakdown we had in Amir'drassil, which looked like basically like this in terms of popularity. Like, those were the top three, and Prot Warrior was down here in absolute, like, just in hell. I think it's probably going to wind up a bit more like this, where Monk drops a bit because their tier set's just not that great. Blood Decay makes a bit of a jump up because their tier set is pretty great. Prot Warrior makes a big jump up because their tier set is great, but it's still slightly below average in terms of popularity. Now, if we're talking about Druid, I think the underlying class is actually still really good, even though it got a bunch of nerfs in the middle of Season 2. The problem with it really is just it's going from having an amazing tier set that gave it 15% more damage, rage, and health, and it's getting a tier set that gives it like an ignore pain that lasts for 45 seconds, and you have to take a lot of damage to be able to absorb the whole thing. Now, I suggested in the deep dive state of the class video that, like, if it just popped at the end, if it did like a nullification barrier, the Heart of Azerite minor power from Battle for Azeroth. Wow, that was a lot to remember. Yeah, if Blizzard changed the current state of the Bear Druid tier set to function like that mechanic, where whatever remaining amount left in the absorb would explode at the end and do damage, and then they put like enough of a range on it so that if you're forced out of melee range, like by a couple yards, it will still hit, make it like a 20-yard range or something. I think it would be okay. I think Bear Druid would probably be just fine. Still kind of unpopular, but like pretty good. The problem is that doesn't exist. So the very real possibility of hitting the end of the shield and you've just got like 300,000 damage left in the shield or more, and it just didn't get absorbed and that's just damage output you've lost. I think that's terrible. Like the worst case scenario, which I don't actually think will happen, but the worst case scenario is that Bear Druid is worse than it was even in Vault of the Incarnates. It's like the worst version of Bear Druid since Battle for Azeroth. I don't think it's actually that dire. I do know some Bear Druids who fear that it is that dire. I think Bear Druid's probably going to be the least popular tank and probably going to be like lower into the pack. I mean, obviously least popular, but like lower into the pack in terms of performers as well. Yeah, I think I feel pretty good about putting him in C tier or D tier or like whatever is below everybody else. And then Demon Hunter, the kind of newly redesigned star. I really wanted them to come into this patch being like amazing in raid. I really wanted this to be the raid tier where Demon Hunter finally became like a legit raid tank. But the problem is they kept all of the problems with the class. They just sort of enhanced all of them by doubling down on everything that makes it great in Mythic Plus. So like, just spoiler alert for when we go to the Mythic Plus tier list, they're going to be absolutely slamming over there. They're going to be destroying everything in their wake in Mythic Plus. But in raid, kind of underwhelming. It's a bunch of AoE damage and a bunch of AoE healing and a bunch of mechanics on the class that generate both your damage and your healing and your damage reduction, both of three things. Generate all of that is stuff that scales best into AoE. And if you look at this raid tier, you got one AoE fight right at the start, single target, 3 target fight. That's kind of hard to actually get a full on cleave on. Mostly single target fight, mostly single target fight, single target fight, single target fight. Like, it's just, you know, it's once again a terrible situation for Demon Hunters and raid because they scale so well into AoE, which is great for Mythic Plus, and then raid is full of single target stuff. What can you do? I think that they're probably going to be worse than they wound up being in Aberrus, where they actually wound up being really good tanks eventually, but nobody really appreciated how good they would be going into the tier because they required the tier set to be good in Aberrus, and you can't count on having the tier set for progressing on a tank. So like, they were really good in farm, but now their tier set's getting nerfed, and it's getting nerfed massively. It'll proc like 1/3 as often, and it procs for half as strong. So it's getting nerfed by like, 3 times 2. It's getting nerfed to be like 1/6 as strong as it was before. That's not great, and that's how they're going to be starting out the next raid tier. So I don't think that they're going to be in any shape to compete in the next raid tier. They probably are on the level of Bear Druids, but I don't feel that mean. I mean, like, I still think the underlying class is pretty fun. They have a lot of really nice tools in their kit. They have great mobility. They have pretty good defensive value, like ability to stay alive. There are some situations like the Naimoi fight where there's some environmental damage that is like one of the main bulks of damage of the fight, and you're just not capable of dealing with that at all as a Demon Hunter. I have some great footage of me just dying on that fight as a Demon Hunter. It was brutal. So that's just not, it's what we've come to expect from 11 straight tiers of Demon Hunter. They've gotten to be in one of the world first kills, and then they've been not non-competitive, but not all that competitive in the other 10 tiers. Well, at least they're consistent. I could give them that much. At least they're consistent. They're consistently pretty fun, and they're pretty okay. They're decent, but they're just not going to be that popular. So if I had to rank it all like this, if we're doing popularity list, we're just going to count this as, instead of like S, etc., we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think it's going to go like this. I think that the popularity for tanks in the next tier is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Pally at the top, Blood DK second, Brewmaster Monk third, 4th as Warrior, 5th as Demon Hunter, and 6th as Bear. But if we did like an actual like ranking, I think that Pally and DK are like very close in power, with Brewmaster lagging behind them, not because of any underlying class issue, just purely because their tier set really sucks for Raid. I think that Prot Warrior is going to be pretty competitive with Brewmaster Monk. I think it might actually be better in most situations in Raid, but I think there will be some spots where Prot Warrior is a lot weaker, like all the damage over time situations, Prot Warrior is going to be weaker. And so I think like those ups and downs make it a riskier choice than Brewmaster Monk, which is like maybe not as good at the highest heights, but consistently better. And then I think Demon Hunter and Bear Druid kind of each has their own separate tiers of like, okay, not bad, just not spectacular, and maybe it is bad, are kind of bringing up the rear there. And I think that'll probably wind up being reflected in the player numbers. I could be wrong. Brewmaster Monk might be more popular than ever. It shouldn't be, though. Their tier set really isn't all that great for Raid. Pretty good in Mythic Plus, though. Demon Hunter, similarly, could be a lot more popular than I'm expecting, just because it's getting such a nice redesign, and it's going to be amazing in Mythic Plus, but that's something you expect to see develop over the first month of a new Mythic Plus season, and you'll see Demon Hunter probably be more popular like a month into the Raid tier when Mythic Plusers are finally going and getting some Raid gear. And I wouldn't expect in the like first 2 or 3 weeks, 2 weeks of the Raid tier for Demon Hunters to be all that popular, because they're getting punished for having an amazing tier set. And the underlying class just isn't all that strong in raids to begin with. All right, that's it. I've gone on long enough. Thank you for watching. Bye.